I am Shushai Adane. My guest today is Getachew Reda, TPLF Executive Committee member, and he is also one of the influential figures in the politics of contemporary Ethiopia. We will try to discuss by just raising some of the burning issues. Stay with us. Welcome to the program, Mr. Getachew.
Thank you.
Okay, just to start with, religious leaders from Ethiopia's Council of Interfaith, along with many prominent individuals, were here in Tigray this week trying to mediate your party, TPLF, and Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's government. I think in this regard, there was a day-long session. What was the end result of that session?
Well, it's not for me to say what the end result of the session was, because the mediation team, the Council of Elders, and representatives of the Interfaith Council had an initiative to come to Tigray and try to bridge the divide, as it were, between Tigray and the federal government, or what they thought, thought was the case. But as far as we're concerned, what we did was, as any self-respecting party in government, we were more than glad to welcome them to come here and raise whatever issue they wanted to raise. Like I said, they're the ones who initiated the process, so we had to welcome them so we could listen to their concerns, their queries, whatever. And once they gave us the details of what they were trying to achieve by coming to Tigray, it was for us to respond positively to their efforts, but we had to also explain to them that this was not just a misunderstanding between the federal government or TPLF or federal government and the government of the state of Tigray. So we had to explain at length that there has been a very dangerous pattern on the part of the head of the Prosperity Party and the current Prime Minister of the country to try to corner the people of Tigray, to try and arm twist the people of Tigray into submitting to his agenda, which runs full in the face of the constitutional arrangement, the multinational constitutional arrangement in this country. And of course, this pattern that has been in sheer display for the last 2 years is now coming to a head, and the Prime Minister and his government have been doing everything in their capacity to disarm the people of Tigray into submission. And this was our explanation, of course, to the extent that there was a divide to be bridged. It could not be between the federal government on the one hand and Tigray on the other. It should be between the forces of reaction that are now in Aratkilo, who are hell-bent on destroying the multinational federal arrangement on the one hand, and those who are equally intent to do everything within their power to save the multinational federal arrangement, because this is an arrangement that has provided nations and nationalities of this country a measure of self-government, and Prosperity Party and its leader are hell-bent on rolling back on the gains of the last 27 years as far as self-government is concerned. And of course, as far as Tigray is concerned, this is not something we will allow to happen. We'll do everything in our power to work with like-minded parties and peoples in Ethiopia, try to maintain the multinational federal arrangement, but any conflict that arises from the Prime Minister, the leader of the Prosperity Parties, resolve to roll back on the gains of the federal arrangement and to establish a unitary state, a one-man unitary state. This is something that pits his force of reaction against the large swath of the Ethiopian population. So, to the extent that there is a case to be made for rapprochement or mediation, it should be between forces of reaction on the one hand and the forces that are trying everything within their power to save the multinational federation on the other. So that was our point. Whether they will succeed in bridging that gap remains to be seen. So for us, all we had to do was to call on the Elders Council and the heads of the Interfaith Council to try and bring a national forum where all political parties of all persuasions can come together and find a way to bring the nation out of this impasse that it finds itself in because of the authoritarian proclivities of the people in Arat Kilo.
Okay, so do you think that there is a kind of enabling environment to bring all forces together around the state?
Well, I don't see this as a very complicated process. Well, there has to be a willingness on the part of the leadership in Arat Kilo to come to terms with the fact that they have through their reckless measures, they have brought the nation to the brink of collapse. Most of the country is under strict military administration. In fact, issues can be made of whether or not the military administration that is imposed in many parts of the country is constitutional at all. But there is little or no regard to what the constitution has to say. Of course, as you have heard, Prime Minister Abiy has orchestrated a poorly written drama to extend his indefinitely extend his handle on power through interpretation of the constitution, which itself is very unconstitutional. So, to the extent that there is a realization on the part of Prosperity Party and its leader that the kind of crisis they have unleashed in this country cannot be resolved unless you bring together all political forces in this country. As long as there is a willingness on their part to at least realize for a moment that they do not have monopoly over what works and what doesn't, as far as political solutions are concerned, I think it's still possible to bring the parties together. For us, for TPLF, we're not interested in punching above our weight, as it were, and we want to maintain peace and stability in our region, and we will never compromise on our people's hard-won rights, self-government rights, and anything that is going to endanger the self-government rights of Tigray, the people of Tigray, is totally unacceptable. That's why people think we are on a head-on collision course with the Prosperity Party, because it has orchestrated an unconstitutional usurpation of power with the pretext of interpreting the constitution, but if anything, such an exercise has only brought matters to a head, in the sense that all political parties who have had very slim sort of expectation that the people in the corridors of power would listen to reason are now realizing that Prime Minister Abiy and his cabal is not interested in listening to reason, and in fact they think they can extend their power indefinitely, and they have effectively decided to create what commentators now describe as a corona dictatorship, and they are using the corona epidemic as a pretext to extend their power indefinitely. But unfortunately for them, the reality on the ground doesn't support the perpetuation of such an ill-designed move. And if they decide to go ahead with their plans, that will only lead to the disintegration of the country. Because, you know, disintegration doesn't have to be physical. Disintegration of a country is about creating a situation where the very social fabric, political fabric that holds nations together starts to fray. And whether there is no cataclysmic disintegration that can be manifested physically doesn't mean the country the Ethiopian state will continue to thrive in the face of such challenge. So, like I said, it's still in the hands of the ball, as they say, is in the courts of Abiy Ahmed, and he has to realize that there is little, if anything, he can do to stem the tide of popular anger and discontent by simply clinging to his somewhat childish dreams of becoming an emperor, a 21st century emperor, and that, as far as we're concerned, is absolutely unacceptable. At least as far as Tigray goes, it will never allow anyone to tamper with our self-government rights. Of course, we'll go ahead with whatever is necessary to maintain this hard-won rights of the people of Tigray. Okay. But like I said, the country finds itself in a very critical juncture, and the Council of Elders did a very good job to try to, at least they understand how precarious the situation is.
The criticality of the situation, you mean?
Yes, and that explains why they went to extra mile to come here and raise issues, and we empathize with them, and we expect, of course, people in the corridors of power in Addis Ababa to understand how precarious the situation is. If they continue to bury their head in the sand and deny reality, which they seem to be very good at, they will have decided to preside over the disintegration of the country.
How do you describe the existing state of affairs? Of course, you were touching it to some extent. So how do you describe the existing state of affairs in Ethiopia?
Well, you see, it is the last 4 years there has been discontent all over the country. In fact, the discontent, the popular discontent, the last 3-4 years was in fact what led to change of guard in Arakilo. And when EPRDF, the then ruling party EPRDF, realized that its old answers were spawning new questions, there was little progress you could achieve by resorting to the same old measures. So there was a clear understanding on the part of the leadership that a reform of sorts was necessary. So it decided to undertake sweeping reforms. And it was this popular discontent, Prime Minister Abiy and his comrades rode to power. They came to power riding this very popular discontent, and the most normal thing for them to do should have been to focus on the very questions that led to this popular discontent: youth unemployment, the issue of equitable distribution of benefits across cross-section of the society. It's still the number of issues, you know. There has been tremendous success in economic, in political, in social aspects in this country for the last 20-something years, but the fact that Ethiopia had to start from a very low base, both economically, politically, meant that there were still tremendous tasks ahead. And of course, there were millions of youth still not seeing light at the end of the tunnel. So the most normal thing Abiy Ahmed and his comrades should have done was to make good on their promise to address the very questions that led to the change of guard in Iraq. So rather than addressing the very demands that brought him into power in the first place, he started to implement honestly very dangerous political agenda that were meant specifically to dismantle the multinational federal arrangement. To the extent that people had issues, they were demanding more self-government, not less self-government. To the extent that the youth had issues, they were expecting the people in Arat Kilo to address their demands and to be allowed to exercise a full measure of self-government, right? Not to be robbed of the very rights that gave them the opportunity to air out their grievances in the first place. So Prime Minister Abiy had a totally different agenda. He became a prime minister to address, to build on the pluses and to work on the minuses, but he started to chart a new, he claimed to start a new path. But unfortunately, intentions, no matter how good, do not necessarily translate into good results. But in the case of the leader of the Prosperity Party, I doubt if there was a good intention in the first place. He was more interested in solidifying his power, and he started doing it by what Madeleine Albright calls the chicken plucking formula. When you start plucking a chicken, you don't start by plucking every part of the chicken. You start plucking a feather, and you start plucking the entire chicken feather by feather. And by the time you pluck a chicken, it squeaks, but it's not going to draw much attention, much uproar. So by the time you pluck every feather, the last feather, the chicken will be gone. So he was dismantling the constitutional arrangement feather by feather. And he has reached a point now where he organized a poorly written legal circus where people who should not be in the business of interpreting the constitution in the absence of an issue to be interpreted did something absolutely ridiculous even by their standards, in the sense that at least it was hoped that they would come up with, by many, it was hoped that they would come up with a timetable which would give some doubters reassurance that maybe the leader of the Prosperity Party is interested in elections after all. But they have decided their decision, their recommendation, which is now endorsed by the House of Federation, is so ridiculous, even by their own standards, that it gives indefinite power to Abiy and his Prosperity Party to determine when to consider the coronavirus threat not a threat anymore. I mean, so we are expected to hear from them when corona ceases to become a threat, a public health threat, which by all scientific standards will take a minimum of, if Americans have difficulty determining whether it will cease to be a threat in the next 3 years, it would require a very fertile imagination to assume that it will cease to be a threat in Ethiopia in the coming year or so. So obviously, what we have been told is that this cabal, and of course with Abiy Ahmed at the helm of this group, will remain in power indefinitely. And in fact, the ridiculousness of the so-called constitutional interpretation is so amazing that even after they decide corona threat to be over, they have given them an additional 1 year period to prepare for elections. So we don't exactly know how long that interlude will last. It will probably last 5 years. I'm being very conservative, but knowing how the leader of the Prosperity Party really likes to look at things, that would probably take even more than 5 years. So whatever plays out in practice is immaterial. What we have seen is the process of dismantling the constitutional arrangement that started by plucking it feather by feather has now reached a point where the constitution hardly means anything anymore. So we have reached a point where people who even had the remotest of phase and even the staunchest of faith in the leader of the Prosperity Party have now come to believe that maybe after all their hope was a misplaced one. And Ethiopia, for example,
let me interrupt you. Sorry for the interruption. Anyways,
no problem.
The intention of my question, we'll proceed to that, of course. The intention of my question is just to describe the current situation in Ethiopia in terms of, for instance, peace and security, constitutional system. You always say that, by you I mean your party TPLF.
Yes.
Yeah, you always say that the country is now on the brink of being disintegrated.
I told you, if the largest swath of the country, I would say 2/3 of the country is under
military command.
Military command. Okay. That speaks volumes about the state of affairs the country finds itself in. But for me, the most important issue is not whether there are millions of internally displaced people. What exactly brought about the internal displacement of millions of people? It is the lack of focus in leadership and the cavalier attitude the people leadership has towards constitutional rule of law, constitutionalism, and all those things. I mean, I'm not saying the ride has been a very smooth one the last 20-something years. We have had more than our fair share of problems here and there. But at least there was a focus on trying to address the people's issues rather than trying to save one's hold on power. I mean, what's the point of holding on to power if you're not going to use your power to do something to the people? I mean, you don't have the greatest of intentions. You don't have the most benevolent of gestures, but at least for the sake of ingratiating yourself with the public, there are things you do to please please your subjects as it were. But as far as the people leader is concerned, his 100% focus, I would tell you, is maintaining his hold on power. And if you are interested in maintaining your hold on power at the expense of everything that is held dear by Ethiopians of all walks of life, and then the kind of situation that's unfolding now is only a natural consequence of that. So yes, the Prime Minister has managed to replace each and every regional administrator, and now he gives direct orders to every one of them. So he's not challenging. But the fact that he has control over the state houses in every capital in the 9 regions doesn't necessarily translate into a complete control over the 9 regions, the 8 regions at least. So he doesn't have control over the 8 regions because, like I said, every region is under a military command, and that military command itself is imposed in a manner that runs counter to the constitution itself. So what we have is a situation where displacement has become almost normal. In fact, in political parlance, often the state is referred to as the institution that has monopoly of power. But with regard to the monopoly of power, now the decentralization of violence is supposed to be monopolized by the state, but now it has been decentralized to such an extent that even tax collection is being privatized in many parts of the country. I mean, I don't want to go to great lengths to describe how racketeering, banditry and everything is becoming the order of the day in many regions in the country. So generally speaking, the fact that the people leadership was exclusively focused on trying to maintain its hold on power, irrespective of what its consequences are to the people, simply meant the country has reached to a point where we can no longer imagine what's going to happen tomorrow. But at least as far as we know, for example, in Tigray, the people leader, it was a good thing that he tried to make peace with Eritrea, but he ended up making peace with President Isaias, but not translating that peace into peace between Eritrea and Ethiopia. But in fact, much worse to the fact that there is little in the way of peace between the 2 countries is that the 2 leaders are working in cahoots to try and corner TPLF in the government of Tigray and the people of Tigray. Whether that will work remains to be seen. But for a leader of a country to conspire against his own people, because he's more interested in maintaining his hold on power, even if maintaining one's hold on power requires sacrificing your own people, so be it. That seems to be the logic that informs most of this. So Ethiopia, as far as we understand, is at crossroads now. It's simple. Let me break it down into what such an impasse would have by way of consequences. If Tigray goes ahead with elections, and it will, and the PP leader makes good on his threat to use force to stop Tigray from holding elections, that makes him probably an unprecedented so-called reformer, making public threat to use force against someone who is trying to exercise their constitutional right to election. But if he tries to make good on that threat, then obviously that will lead to a situation where Tigray will have to fend for itself. And of course, if history is any guide, we have people who have paid dearly to erect a system recognize their government rights, full self-government rights, and anything that stands in the way of our self-government rights is absolutely unacceptable to us. So any effort to impose Addis Ababa's will on Tigray will result in a totally changed relationship between Tigray and Addis Ababa, and that what the implication will be to the continuity of the Ethiopian state is anybody's guess.
But I would like to know your justifications. You said that Abiy Ahmed's leadership is conspiring with external forces, just like with Eritrea, you said, yes, to weaken Tigray. How could you justify that?
Well, I mean, I'm not the one who's conspiring, so I don't have to justify that.
No, how could you justify that?
Oh,
He's
yeah,
conspiring against Tigray. Yeah, with external
do
forces.
I have to substantiate that? Mm-hmm. Look, I mean, what's the point of having a peace? I'm not going to give you details in public. There is no point in giving you what sort of military preparations are made. That I don't think is necessary. But look, if you make peace, if Ethiopia and Eritrea make peace, and the most natural thing to do is to allow the free flow of people, at least. Not goods and services, let's forget goods and services. There is little in the way of goods and services, at least in terms of volume, it could be marginal, it could be far too negligible to really matter. But the flow of people is what is critical in further cementing.
You mean from and to Eritrea and Ethiopia?
Ethiopia, yeah. So yes, the first couple months there was a flow of goods, but it was understood to be a threat by the regime in Asmara, apparently, and the president in Asmara, the leader in Asmara, decided to close the borders. And you close the border and you tell us there is peace between the two countries. Of course, the military build up and everything. And don't worry, it's not even a secret. President Isaias was promising to do something about Ethiopia. He said word for word that he wouldn't sit idly by while people are trying. I mean, there is discontent all over the country. It's not, Tigray is at peace with itself, and we have a measure of self-government. That still we have a long way to go to address youth challenge, to address people's demands, good governance, whatever issues. But we are doing everything in our power, and most of the activities that we carry out are what are generally considered to be the normal functions of a state, a functioning state. That's not the case in many parts of the country. But President Isaias was promising in public to interfere with Ethiopia's affairs and to do something about. So he was telling us that to the extent that there was a threat to Abiy's power coming in the form of popular discontent or whatever, and then he would sit idly by. Which self-respecting leader would allow a friendly government, whether that they really are friendly governments is a totally different story. A leader of a neighboring country to declare in public that he will readily interfere with country. I mean, it should have incensed the prosperity leader to a point where he should have told his counterpart in Asmara to shut up. No, he wouldn't do that because there is no point for him to tell him to shut up because he's doing it on his behalf. He's doing it well. At least the pretext is that he's doing it in Abiy's best interest. So the point is, I don't have to come up with a laundry list of the explanations why we believe they are working in cahoots. It requires a very naive person to assume that there indeed is peace between Ethiopia and Eritrea when the only peace that exists is between President Isaias and Prime Minister Abiy.
So you mean it's an open secret?
What?
You mean it's an open secret that
it is.
Isaias is interfering in the internal affairs of Ethiopia?
Well, you listen to Tigrinya, right? You understand Tigrinya?
Yes.
So he was making these remarks in Tigrinya.
Yeah,
for hours on end. He hardly mentioned Eritrea. It's as if he is in charge of Ethiopia, not Eritrea. He was talking about Ethiopia to such an extent that you would be excused if you assume that he is the new Ethiopian leader. Prime Minister Abiy wouldn't say a word against that. Why should he say that? About that, obviously, he was doing it at his behest.
Okay. Who do you think must be held accountable for all these crises in Ethiopia? We know the current situation in Ethiopia, and you have been mentioning it, of course. Yeah.
Well, all political players have a role to play. So I'll take my share of the blame. No, yeah, I mean, you know, like I told you, this has been in the making for the last 4 years. But in 2017, we came clean. We said, you know, we'll be responsible for this and that, and we want to make good on. We want to make up to our people. At least in Tigray, this is a very promise we made to our people. We've been behaving irresponsibly, and we have put our people at risk. We have betrayed. We said we've betrayed our people, and of course we have to make it up to them. And that's 2017. In 2018, a new prime minister came to office, and we were hoping that he would cheerlead EPRDF's efforts to make it up to the people of Ethiopia. He made so many flowery remarks in public, but there was little in the way of substance. So like I said, as far as we're concerned, and although I cannot squarely blame Abiy for everything that's gone wrong in this country, but the bigger chunk of the responsibility rests with him. He is responsible because he's a guy who, you know, the Prosperity Party is a one-man show. I mean, there are small-time crooks that surround him, but most of the decisions are made by the leader of the PP. So ultimately, yes, all of us would have to take part of our blame, but if something happens to the country, the largest chunk of the responsibility is within the PP, and more importantly, within its leader.
But the new leadership accuses you of being the root cause of all these crises across the nation.
Who is it?
The new leadership, Abiy Ahmed's government. Yeah, always accuses you of being the root cause of all these crises. Not only that, but also all the state-owned giant media at the center. Yes, have been saying so. So how do you respond to that?
You know, if you are in the habit of lying left and right, if you are in the habit of blaming everything on someone, so you can I mean, shirk responsibility of sorts. It could help in the short run, but it's not going to endear you to the public. Abiy was at his most had his most popular moments the first 6 months, I would say, of his leadership, because people were hoping that his beautiful words would translate into something. I mean, the irony is, rather than collecting himself together and focus on the actual responsibility of governing, he was more interested in a series of poorly written dramas on the media, blaming everything on TPLF or everything. I mean, if, you know, Abiy was a member of the senior leadership of Opidio, and Opidio was in charge of Oromia. Demeka was in charge of Amhara. All of them had their own respective grounds, and to the extent that they have issues with TPLF, they can only have themselves to blame. You see, even as a media tactic, it would work for a couple months. But after that, people are often fed up with people who do not assume responsibility for the choices they make. I mean, you know, one has to be courageous. You assume for responsibility for the consequences of your choices. Abiy doesn't have that capacity. I doubt if he really understands the complexity of Ethiopia. He thinks everything can be dictated from Arat Kilo. Look, Ethiopia, thanks to the constitution, the very constitution they are now telling us they have the deepest love and respect for, simply meant people now take their self-government rights seriously. To the extent that there are issues in Oromia, it's one of more self-government, not less self-government. To the extent there are issues in Amhara, it's more of self-government than less of self-government. Likewise, in Tigray, what we are demanding is more of self-government than less of self-government. And to expect Abiy's magic to work its way to every region in the country, that is plain childish. So, am I going to blame for the crisis that is unfolding in many parts of Oromia, Western Oromia? Am I to blame for the kind of atrocities that have been committed in Welega, in Western Oromia, in Guji, in Borana, in many parts of Oromia? How the heck am I supposed to be blamed for all that? It happened the last 2 years. You know, 3 years ago, under EPRDF, Ethiopia still had problems, but it was one of the fastest growing economies. It had internally displaced people, but very, very negligible in the number compared to the number of refugees we welcome from many parts of Africa. Now, we have this dubious honor of becoming having the largest number of internally displaced people. And it's not my making, it's Abiy's making. And Abiy is more interested in trying to explain away or find someone to be blamed for what he has created by his failure of leadership, than trying to address the very root causes that gave rise to such a state of affairs in the first place. Now, even the staunchest of his supporters do not take that kind of fiction seriously anymore. That TPLF is going to blame for everything. That had its own traction at some point, but it's no more a very appealing idea. You can come up with the Walters, the Fanas of the world, the EBCs of the world, can come up with documentary after documentary blaming TPLF for everything. People have bread and butter issues. People have real, genuine security concerns. They need peace and security. They need bread. They need employment opportunities. And you're not going to tell them TPLF took all the employment opportunities to Tigray. That's plain bullshit. Pardon my friend. Now, the question is, it should have dawned on him and his leadership that governing is not about blaming your predecessors. More importantly, it's about taking the bull by its horn and doing whatever normal governments are supposed to do, which is addressing the very demands that brought about your premiership in the first place. And it was the views of Oromia who were calling for more jobs, more security, on whose revolt he rode to office, right? And the most natural thing for him to do should have been to address those demands that brought him to office in the first place. But that's not what he thought was the most important thing to do. He was more interested in finding people to blame. But now, even the staunchest of his supporters wouldn't buy that kind of fiction. And so TPLF is doing this job. It has a lot of homework to do because, like I said, when we promised in public in 2017 that we had, in fact, betrayed the trust people have put in us, and that we had to make up for our misbehaviors. We still have a long way to go before we can say we have done enough. We have barely scratched the surface, so we have tons of things to do. And we, as a responsible party, are trying to do everything in our power to make sure that we stay that course. And of course, rather than joining us in this noble cause of addressing our people's concerns, the PP leadership and the PP leader are busy trying to derail us from that path, and in fact stoke up violence here and there. And there is an obvious appetite on the part of the PP leader to use violence as a means of extending his grip on power. But unfortunately, violence begets violence, and there is no way an ill-advised and an ill-prepared leader can continue to stoke violence and try to thrive from chaos and violence. That I don't think will work.
Okay, let's come to another question. How did you find the foreign policy of this new leadership as compared to those of 27 years? Because you always accuse Abiy Ahmed's leadership, foreign policy, of not being Ethiopia-centered, Africa-centered, blah, blah. How did you find that?